Centennial.
Glad to, but we'll also tell the story for us, and they'll fill in the facts that we have researched.
There's one thing I know that brought the immigrants to the Dakota Territory more than any other factor. That was the Homestead Act.
I've heard of it, but just what are all the facts?
The Homestead Act, passed in 1862, passed an important part in the development of the rural easements. The Act gave 160 acres free to any citizen building a house or building 9 by 12. It was not specified feet or inches, and some speculators did put a building 9 inches by 12 inches on their property. They also had to live on it for 5 years and work at least 5 acres. This was called proving up the land.
Also, later the requirement was reduced to 3 years, and Civil War veterans could count their years of military service toward the homesteading requirement. An additional 160 acres could be obtained as a tree claim. The homesteader promised to plant trees on 40 acres of the quarter section and to cultivate them and keep them alive.
Later, the government realized that how impossible that was to do and changed the 40 acres to 10 acres. In addition, preemption claims that government land could be purchased for $1.25 an acre. The railroad was also available for purchase.
Many of these trees still stand, as do the big cottonwood trees beneath them, planted in the 1880s.
I'd like to ask my mom and dad to tell about our ancestors' adventures as immigrants.
In 1880, the Nybar family and friends from Silesia, Germany, immigrated to America on the ship Simbra and landed on July 22nd at New York City. The 2 youngest children were sick on the boat from a relapse of measles. They were wrapped in blankets as they passed the officers so that they would not be detained at Ellis Island and be quarantined. They traveled west to Wisconsin, where they were hired to work in the harvest fields following the reaper, tying bundles and shotting grain. They decided to head for Dakota Territory. At first they were going to leave the sick children with friends in Wisconsin, but decided to take them along so the Maria and Paul could be buried by their new homes. They had purchased tickets in Alexander, Dakota Territory because the agent said that was as far as the tracks had been built. But when they arrived at Alexander, they were able to buy tickets to Mitchell and were the first to ride the train to Mitchell from Alexandria. The train moved so slow over the new tracks that the men could walk faster than the train. Early the next day, the men walked west to look over the land. When the men had walked some distance west of Plankington and saw the land was back from prairie fires, they decided to return to Mitchell and look elsewhere. Mitchell at that time had 6 shed-type buildings. The next morning they pooled their money and hired Theodore Brett, a locator with a team of horses and a hack, and went south as far as Star, now Dema, and was told it was a Catholic area and that the Protestants were located west of there. They homesteaded there on a farm where Christian Nybar's grandson Vernon still lives, west of Dema. When they arrived there, the grass was as high as a man. Maria and Paul died on September 11th and 19th and were buried on the homestead in small caskets made from only lumber to be found rough boards, padded with hay and lined with homespun bleached linen brought from Germany. When the sod houses was finished, some of the men went to Mitchell and worked for the railroad for 75 cents a day, while the other 2 worked the clay. The first snow came on October 3rd, and the oxen strayed away. Christian headed northeast, looking for them, and walked 3 miles. When he came to Bartell Home Place and was told he was looking the wrong direction, cattle walked with the winter storm and against it in the summer. He didn't know that this because in Germany the cattle was always penned in. Against the advice of Mr. Home, Christian Neubauer headed home as he knew his family would be worried. Before he left, Mr. Home told him not to worry about the oxen as they would stray in the first cornfield and would come home on their own. He also told Christian to keep his eyes on the place or he would stray off course and get lost. Christian missed the house but came to the barn. About 10 that night, a knock was heard on the sod house door. There was the lead oxen. He got a royal welcome and was brought into the sod house. And other one came home the next day.
All right, we have a special treat tonight.
And Mrs. Pauline Mysteric is going to sing a song. She's the youngest daughter of Christian Neubauer. She's going to sing South Dakota and When the Well Moves Dry.
And she's 91 years old this year, is that right?
Right, November 17th.
Laverne, she's right behind that post. Could you move her this way or else that way, one way or the other, so that they can yeah, that'll be fine.
From Illinois I started the location for to find. I heard of a distant country, a country most sublime, a land of milk and honey and water of the best. They call it South Dakota, the beauty of the West. I landed in Sioux City, but I did not like the town. The streets, they were so narrow and muddy was the ground. I went into a restaurant and rode upon my chest. I'm bound for South Dakota, the beauty of the West. I went on board a steamer, the Northern billed my name, and they pulled up their anchor and we were off again. They rang their bells for Yankton, the town where I was a guest, in the state of South Dakota, the beauty of the West. The Yankton girls are clever, the Yankton girls are kind. I soon forgot poor Polly, the girl I left behind. The girls are rich in beauty and temper of the best, in the state of South Dakota, the beauty of the West. I had not recruited no more than a week or two. I traveled South Dakota, I traveled through and through. I came to a little shanty, was there a welcome guest, in the state of South Dakota, the beauty of the West. Some people call us coyotes, but this we do not mind. We're just as good a bachelor as any other kind. The coyote girls are cunning, the coyote girls are shy. I'll marry me a coyote girl, or bachelor I will die. I'll wear a stand-up collar, support a handsome wife, and I live in South Dakota, the balance of my life. When a child I lived at Lincoln with my parents on the farm, and the lesson that my mother taught me has never lost its charm. Oft would she take me on her knee when tired of childish play, and as she pressed me to her breast, I'd hear her gently say, Waste not, want not is the lesson I will teach. Let your watchword be dispatch and practice what you preach. Don't let your chances like sunbeams pass you by, for you'll never miss the water till the well runs dry. As your days goes by, I grew to be a mischief-making boy. Destruction seemed my only sport, it was my only joy. Oft times do I remember, when rightfully chastised, how my father sat beside me, and thus he would reply, waste not, want not is the lesson I will teach. Let your watchword be dispatch and practice what you preach. Don't let your chances like sunbeams pass you by, for you'll never miss the water till the well runs dry. As I arrived at manhood and embarked in public life, I found it was a rugged road bestrewn with care and strife. I speculated foolishly, my losses were severe, but still a tiny little voice kept whispering in my ear. Waste not, want not is the lesson I will teach. Let your watchword be dispatch and practice what you preach. Don't let your chances like sunbeams pass you by, for you'll never miss the water till the well runs dry. Then I studied strict economy and found to my surprise that my funds, instead of sinking, full soon began to rise. I grasped each chance and always struck the iron while 'twas hot. I seized my opportunities and never once forgot. Waste not, want not is the lesson I will teach. Let your watchword be dispatch and practice what you preach. Don't let your chances like sunbeams pass you by, for you'll never miss the water till the well runs dry. I'm married now and happy, have a careful little wife. We live in peace and harmony, devoid of care and strife. Good fortune smiled upon me, I have little children 3, and the lesson that I'll teach them as they prattle round my knee. Waste not, want not is the lesson I will teach. Let your watchword be dispatch and practice what you preach. Don't let your chances like sunbeams pass you by, for you'll never miss the water till the well runs dry.
For the other mothers in the area. Their claim was 160 acres with no fences or trees. 2 years later, the railroad came from the south. The Charlie Dunk's house in Easton is the gold-painted house just north of the school schoolyard, now occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Don Mason. The homestead house was later moved into Ethan, and Jack Moore and his wife now live in it. Mrs. Vickers remembered the building of the railroad, how they would sneak down by the tent that housed the railroad workers and listen to their stories. She also remembers that her mother brought along a pair of redbirds from Missouri. She traded them for some chickens so they would have eggs and meat. They also led their cow behind the wagon. An interesting sideline story about Mrs. Vickers as a baby is that her mother was very sick, so Mrs. Frank Mutziger, who had homesteaded 2 miles west of Ethan, took Rose and nursed her along with her son Henry. Oftentimes, ladies helped new mothers in this way. Henry was considered the first white boy born in the Ethan area. The Dunks did not stay long on their tree claim. While building their new home in 1886, just north of the school where Mr. and Mrs. Don Mason live now, they lived in a shack left by the railroad. They had a large barn, milked a cow, and had chickens. Some of the teachers left their horses in this barn.
Another early settler in the Ethan area was my mother, Miss Esther Freeman. She was born at Mount Auburn, Iowa in 1882. She came to the Dakota Territory with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Henry Meyer, by train in 1884 at the age of 2. They came to Alexandria, and some people with horses and wagons came and got them. They lived on rented farms until her dad purchased 80 acres in Worthing Township, near Worthing No. 2 School, where some of the children were educated. Her parents were buried at the Hope Chapel Cemetery, which was Presbyterian. After the chapel was discontinued, the graves were moved to the Ethan Cemetery. Well, when she was 13 years of age, she herded sheep at the Roy Foot Farm in the River Hills, on the James River Hills, east of Ethan. With this money, she bought all of her clothes for school, which included her shoes, her coat, her dresses, everything she needed for school. At the age of 18, she took a 6-month preparatory teaching course at Dakota Wesleyan University, and she went to the county superintendent's office in Allen, and they wrote examinations for 2 days and got her second grade certificate so she could teach school. She taught 3 years at the No. 2 school in Worthing Township. When she was 21, she went to Lyman County. This was before she was married and homesteaded there for 2 years. She married Frank Freeman, who was a neighbor boy, and they only lived 2 miles from them, in 1905. And they went through a lot of the joys and sorrows of the pioneer times. And one winter, they burned ear corn because it was cheaper than coal. Corn was worth only 10 cents a bushel. And Mr. Freeman passed away in July of 1975, living almost 93 years.
In 1875, there was a trading post and a post office located 2 miles south and 2 miles east of the present water tank, run by Mr. and Mrs. W.C. Gillis. Their home was in the back of the store. This first settlement was called Worthing. Mail was delivered there once a week on horseback. With the news of the railroad coming, Mr. Gillis moved his store and post office 2 miles west to the land just west of Mr. and Mrs. Ross Hingelfeld. H.T. Larson ran the creamery there, and they also had a flowing well. This settlement was called Rome. By 1880, this village had about 100 residents. Ole Rosenquist established a blacksmith shop to take care of the horses and wagons. But to the dismay of these people, the railroad builders decided the town should be located 2 miles to the north of Rome settlement. Because the trains needed to take on water and operate the boilers about every 10 miles, so the town was moved. The railroad men changed the town to Ethan, honoring Ethan Allen of the Revolutionary War days. The village of Rome was once Charles and Mary Daunt's pasture. When the railroad came, the land for the railroad was purchased from Charles and Mary Daunt. By this time, they lived in the Dow House north of the present water tank.
I'm hungry. That reminds me. How about stores in Newtown?
In 1883, when the railroad said the new town would be Ethan, Cy Gillis moved his store to the corner of the lot, on the southwest corner of the main intersection of Ethan's Main Street today, at the location of the present Reinhardt's building, or Mrs. Caroline Reinhardt's home. By 1885, a general store, built by Mr. Snow, was located just east of the present hotel, or Dave Fritz's bar.
Boy, I bet the kids at that time didn't have to worry about school. Or what do you think?
Education was of importance in those days. Cy Gillis built a lean-to on the backside of his store, which was used for the first school in Easton in 1883. The first teacher was Nellie King. In 1885, the first wooden school was built at the site of the present school. It was a small one-room school with a few windows and one teacher, and the teacher's name was Joe Craig. Some of the students were the Cutts boys, Tobin boys, the Ortman boys, and the Cole and the Drake boys. The toilets were located outside and a well provided. By 1903, 50 students attended school, one teacher by the name of Joe Gallagher, and also carried mail to the surrounding community in a little covered cart. The Gallagher home is known now as the Fred Ward site. Then in 1903, the first brick school was built. It had 4 rooms, and the classes went from the 1st to the 8th. The old school was moved to the Vanderwert lot, and is part of that house now. Liz Whippy, Bob Whippy's mother, attended that school and is on one of the school pictures. The first custodian was Dick Truitt in 1913. The front addition of the school was added in 1922 to the old square school. In 1923, the high school classes were added. 3 teachers were hired for the 50 students. The first students to graduate were Mary Bauer, which was one of my school teachers when I went to grade school for 5 years, and Joe Holmes, Bernice Graves, Clifford Tiffin, Elsie Sprinkle, Lillian Sedestrom, and Gladys Sprinkle. They graduated in 1924. Miss Helen Custis taught in Easton the longest, 33 years in the 7th and 8th grade. And also, Mrs. Reuben Wistrup, which is on the stand with us today, she also graduated in 1925 from that school. And the gym was built in later years in 1939 and 1940. And the newest addition was added in 1971 and the shop in 1975. Another addition to the music room had been the Rome 36 school, which lay 2 miles west of Easton, was moved into Easton, and that's where I attended school there, and also 9 of my brothers and sisters also attended that same grade school. And that was moved into Easton approximately back in 69 or 1970.
Well, how about religion? It seems that these people were so far away from civilization, as we call it today.
The first form of worship was provided by a Reverend List at the new town of Rome. He traveled from settlement to settlement.
Hi, Lamia, why don't you stand up because we can't see you. There you go.
The first form of worship was provided by a Reverend Bliss at the new town of Rome. He traveled from settlement to settlement and held church services at the trading post. Services were also held in homes and even at the schoolhouse and depot. In 1884, Jonas Nelson and Eugene Graves, assisted by local Methodist parishioners, built the white church that is still standing on the original plot. Although it has been remodeled, the exterior has changed very little except for the tower. In the early days, hitching posts lined the street in front of the church to tie up their horses while the parishioners attended services. Members would entertain ministers in their homes and help care for the church. The first marriage performed in the Methodist Church was on November 24, 1888, when Frank Rathbun was married to Alma Rugg. The first organist was Kate Dodd, till she lost her legs in the 1988 blizzard.
Was that the only church in Eaton?
The people belonging to the Catholic faith did not have a church until 1887. Before that, they attended church at Devon, which was called Star at that time, until their church was built south of the old parish hall, next to the old firehouse. 19 families made up the first parish. Many of their relatives are still part of the parish today.
Excuse me, John. Louder. Bring your mic up.
The first priest was Reverend Victor Scherr. According to one story, it has been said that the church burned in 1904. But if it did, it only partially burned, because that church building is being used by Ed Erkenbach and Clausen Insurance today. If you look closely on the west side of the building, you can see where the church windows have been boarded up. Later in 1904, Reverend Brahms reorganized the parish and purchased 2 acres of land at the present location for $250 and constructed a church for $10,041.72. The first priest's home was what is the Keith Kleiner home now. This church burned down in October of 1960, the afternoon of Mrs. Anna Clark's funeral. The present church was dedicated in July 1, 1962. The Legion Hall for 2 years served as a place for Catholic Mass. Reverend William Eccles served the Catholic community for 33 years, longer than any other pastor.
As the people came to Easton, where could they stay till they found land? And did they have to phase them?
The first hotel was built by Mr. Niles. On the west end of Main Street, on the north side, in 1884. It was run by Mr. Niles until 1903, when he sold it to Joe Scheich, my grandpa. From an 8 or 9 room, 2-story building, it was enlarged to a 20-room hotel and named it Commercial Hotel. He added on to it a big office, large dining room, and a kitchen to the east. The upstairs was enlarged to 12 or 14 rooms, and downstairs in the old part was a big pantry attached to the kitchen and his own family living quarters. The cellar had a big cistern, and the new part was a full-size basement including full-length windows and one outside door going to the east towards the sidewalk level. The other door to the north had a porch to the kitchen overhead. The new part of the basement was used as a Catholic church when the fire destroyed part of the other church. It was also once used as a wholesale liquor house when Mitchell went dry and Ethan didn't. It was also used as a printing office. Connor Scheich used it to test milk for the creamery. Scheich also ran the livery stable and grave, which was behind a hotel, separated from each other by an alley, the only alley in town. Behind this was a barnyard and chicken coop, then a street, and on to the north was the town jail. The kids used the jail as a playhouse until a prisoner had to be locked up. Then naturally the kids moved out. Later the jail was moved to south of the old parish hall and was also the town hall. Another livery stable was also run by Art Pierce. The first railroad came to Eaton in 1883, the Chicago-Milwaukee Company. The building of the tracks was a slow process
process due to the fact that the work was all done by hand and with the help of horses. They could average about 2 to 3 miles daily. The workers had a tent town built in Ethan near the tracks for board and room. This is the tent town that Rose Vickers said that she spied on as a little girl. In 1884, the first train depot opened at the west end of Main Street on the north side of the street. This depot was used till it was closed in approximately 1958, and the last depot agent was Bill Vanderwerf. One of the early railroad men was a Mr. Weiland, the first section boss in 1883. He built a large house north of the stockyards and lived there for 20 years while serving the railroad. This house is now the home of New Blackman.
The first Tide hardware store was constructed in 1885 by Max Swinnigan, across from the hotel at the west end of town. This was also owned by 7 different owners. The latest occupying the building was the McLean Hatchery, which is located on a storage lot of the Ethan Co-op lumberyard. Another main business was the blacksmith shop. The first one was owned by Sam Rabbitbottom, where the main co-op lumberyard is located, 1 block south of Main, nearest the railroad. Another smithy was J.P. Gross in 1890. By 1902, Rosenquist and Setterstrom operated the blacksmith shops. Later, Setterstrom decided to have his own shop located 1 block north and 1 block east of the present fire station, or on the lot of Bob Wickey's home. Later in the 20s, he built the cement block building 1 block north of the fire station, which is still standing. This building was later used by Bill Smith for the Sunshine Garage, where he sold Buick cars. He is the father of Dr. George Smith, a brain surgeon from Sioux Falls.
Okay, Fran Finder now has a trucking line to ship cattle. How did the farmers manage in those days?
Charles Drake saw the need for some method of the taking care of farm animals. So in 1887, he started the first stockyards, just east of the railroad tracks and south of the co-op elevator. The farmers would herd their animals to town and hold them at the stockyards until they could be shipped out by the railroad. Cattle, hogs, and sheep were herded to the stockyards. Some were hauled in triple box wagons. In the late 20s or early 30s, when Bill Coyne was running the Ethan stockyards, Henry Oster headed a box car of sheep to the yards. They were shipped to Sioux City. When he got his returns, they told him to send more money, that the sheep didn't quite pay all the freight and commission. He rode to Sioux City and told the firm he had no money, but he had more sheep. In 1934, Wilford Kurtenbach helped herd 20 fat cattle to the Ethan yards to be shipped to Sioux City. He netted $260. Bill Coyne was the last stockyard agent. Newt Blackman, do you know something about cattle drives? Or this Charlie Burson on the hog drives?
All I can remember is when I was a kid, Charlie Barson used to drive in a whole trainload of cattle, Ethan, and then he'd ship it to Chicago, and when all the local boys would get a free ride to Chicago. And then, I remember when I was a kid, James Grady used to live west of town, used to drive his hogs to town, like to drive cattle, drive a couple of 100 head of hogs to the stockyards. That's all I know about the cattle drive.
Thanks, Ned.
Did our town have shitty characters, or was our townspeople always law-abiding citizens?
Yes, Kathy, and perhaps one of the most interesting incidents in the history of Ethan is a true story that is recorded in the historical data at Vermilion, South Dakota, known as the Smith case or the hanging of Big Red. Mike Bechtel was described as a bad man, large and powerful, ruddy complected, and his face was covered with a bushy red beard. He and his brother Louis were workers on the railroad and came to work there every day. They, as well as many other railroad men and other men of the town, played cards at the home of John Smith, who lived about 2 miles north of Ethan. It was illegal to play cards in town, so out they went. Most of the men spent their idle time playing cards for lack of other entertainment. One day, Mr. Smith disappeared and could not be found. Suspicion fell on the Bechtel boys because they were the last ones to have been playing cards with Mr. Smith. They were questioned and then released as there was no clear evidence that the vanished man was even dead. Feelings ran high and the local men demanded action. One evening, Mike and Louie were sitting in their shanty when several wagon loads of men pulled into their yard, surprised them and tied them up. They loaded them into one of the wagons and then drove to the old Reinert's farm. Both were questioned, but neither would admit to the crime. Suddenly, one of the men grasped an old army bayonet, turned on Mike. Then the point was thrust into his chest, but with no effect. Tempers flared, and they decided to use the hot iron that was on the stove. This they pressed into his flesh. He still admitted nothing, despite his terrible burns. Then, in desperation to make him confess, they cut off both his ears in front of Lewis, who could do nothing to help his brother. The mob became insanely violent and lost all compassion. They then inflicted an operation that is thought to produce the highest degree of pain. Still he remained silent and would not confess. So they cut out his tongue and then put a rope around his neck and threw it over a rafter in the barn. With his brother watching in horror, they hoisted him to the ceiling several times. He never winced, and the hoisting continued until he was lowered to the floor dead. Then they ordered Lewis to leave the country and remain forever silent, and he was never seen around Eaton again. Several weeks later, two boys were fishing in the James River east of Eaton and happened to catch the hand of a man on their line. Frightened, the boys got help and the body was pulled from the river. Mrs. Dunk of Eaton identified the ring on his finger as belonging to Mike Bechtel. The Smith body was never found, but no one really had proof of his death or his whereabouts. His children were taken in by local people. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Dunk took one of the boys, Charles, and raised him as their own. He lived his later years in Burke and is buried there. The leaders of that desperate mob were the most prominent men in Eaton at that time. None were ever persecuted, and all are now deceased. Most brawls were settled by the fastest draw, and hangings and shootings were frequent. The old barn stood until 1978, when it was demolished.
What happened when you got sick? Where did you go for help?
First doctor came to Eaton. In 1887. He was Dr. W.H. Troll, the father of Kelsey Troll. His office was next to the Gillis store on the south side of the street. In 1890, Dr. Wilson came to town. There was also a Dr. E.S. Bob. He and his family lived above the office he worked in. He traveled by horse and buggy and left his horses at the livery stable. His patients had money. Some patients had money, and when they didn't, they gave him such things as food, oats, hay, eggs. In the 1920s, there came a Dr. Stockdale. Two of his daughters went to the Eaton School. Dr. Wilkinson came to the town in the 1930s. He charged $10 for delivering a baby and would make house calls. Dr. Bob and Stockdale's offices were north of the Legion Hall. Dr. Quinn and Wilkinson's offices were south of the present fire station. There was a dentist in Eaton at one time south of the Blue Oasis. He didn't stay long because most people pulled their own teeth to save money or had no money to pay him with. Maybe Mr. Elizabeth can shed some more light on the doctors.
Well, I know Dr. Wilkinson was in town. We delivered our first two boys. But he had his office in the Rosenquist building where Mrs. Rosenquist used to have her millinery store, you know. And then there was Dr. Quinn, he was a dentist. He was a terribly big fat man. My folks took me and had something done to my teeth. I had toothache, and his finger was so large that he couldn't get it in my mouth. That's all right. That's what I remember about him.
I suppose the lumber companies were the first one in the business in Eaton.
first lumber yards were owned by Mr. Brooms. The yard was located on Main Street east of the present-day firehouse and was begun in 1890 with Saul Knoll as manager. Before this one was built, most of the lumber was shipped from either Mitchell or Yankton. The second lumber yard was established in 1905 and was built by A.W. Smith. One of its last managers was Ed Wiseman. This was known as the Fullerton Lumber Yard and was located between the depot and the hotel or the Fritz's Bar. The last lumber company is the present one, the Eaton Co-op Lumber Company, being operated by Dave Myring.
When did the creameries come about?
In 1902, Ed and Newell Blackman started a creamery at the Water Tower location. The farmers would haul milk and cream in cans to town at the creamery. It was tested for fat content and used for making butter or shipped on the train for other processing. Most of the butter was packed in tubs and shipped to other points. By 1920, Art Blackman run a daily bottled milk route and so forth and delivered it throughout the town. The other factory was run in 1924 where the present cheese factory was and was destroyed by fire, and the Al Feiner and Clarence Reislinger built a new cheese plant in this present day operation.
Your streets in Eaton
Just a
are...
minute. I think we're supposed to.
Al Feiner and Clarence Reisling came to Easton, South Dakota on March 17, 1928. The two had come from Wisconsin where they learned to make cheese. In fact, when Reisling came to Easton, he had already been making cheese for 10 years. Feiner was 26 years old when he came to Easton to start the cheese factory. It was George Bauer, who was later to become Feiner's father-in-law, that got Feiner and Reisling interested in coming to Easton to get it started. Mr. Bauer had a department store here for many years, but always had a dream of opening a cheese factory. He felt that the farmers needed more than just farming to make the best use of their products, and thought that a cheese factory would be a good way to utilize the milk produced. But it was far from easy going to get the business started. One of the main problems was that there was no market for cheese at first. We thought the two wholesalers at the time in Mitchell would be pretty good customers. Then we found out that they used only about 5 boxes of cheese from January until March. We had to get out and really work to get companies to buy the cheese. There was also a little bit of problem with the creameries in the state, and they looked on cheese making as a sort of a black sheep in the dairy business. The creameries didn't want the cheesemakers around, and it was pretty evident when we went to conventions. Of course, now we can show them that we outlasted the creameries and are getting more and more business all the time. And like many businesses in the dirty 30s, Easton Dairy was not without its problems during the Depression. The banks failed, they couldn't borrow money, they couldn't sell their cheese, and farmers were needing their money. I can understand how he got all his gray hair. Then let's see, it goes on here in just a minute. In 1934, they were down to a half a vat of milk for cheese, and we even sold a carload of cheese for 8 cents a pound. He added that when it was especially hot, they used to wet down curtains that hung on the windows of the dairy to keep the building somewhat cooler. And in the winter, the problem was trying to thaw out milk that had frozen in the 10-gallon cans used to carry the milk from the farm to the cheese factory. 16-hour working days were typical, and Reislein is now wearing a hearing aid because of the noisy conditions of the factory. In 1940, Feiner and Reislein dissolved their partnership. Reislein went to Del Rapids, where he operated a dairy for a number of years. Feiner continued the cheese making until 1970, when his son John took over. When we first came here, we couldn't find a market for cheese, and now John can't keep up with the demand. Last year alone, the Eaton Dairy sold more than 1,400,000 pounds of cheese, with most of it going to a distributor in Los Angeles. A new addition was also added last fall to the dairy to enlarge office space and room for making cheese. Other things that have changed include the milk receiving room and the automation of many of the steps in the cheese making process. And nowadays, they have to change the cheese starter every day, which they had never had to do when they were both working. Both Reislein and Feiner agreed that South Dakota was a good place to start a cheese business, but it's only good for those who know the business and are good managers. On June 27, 1978, they celebrated their 50th anniversary of the day they began making cheese at the first cheese factory in the state, still Easton Dairy. Clarence lives in Del Rapids, and Daddy is going to his reward.
Yeah, I think I'd like to have Newt tell us what he had the other night. You had a certain certificate along just to prove how clean or what quality cream he had.
Oh, I did looking through some old papers and I found a certificate for a butter maker in 1902 that my Uncle Ed had to get. I didn't think you had to have a license back that day, but it did. That's when they were running the butter creamy up on the hill. I had the photo to get that at home. Building up there, they used to haul all their cream. Farmers would bring their cream into town, and my uncle was a butter maker, and my dad would haul the butter down to the train, and they'd pack it in tubs and load it on the train and ship it out. And then the empty tubs would come back and they'd haul them up to the creamery, just a rotation process.
That was quite a cheesy and borrowed story, but Ethan streets, they're pretty good today, but how was it in the beginning?
Have I got it on? The roads were dirt and the sidewalks were made of plank or board. The hitching posts lined both sides of the streets. By 1911, Ethan started to improve its streets because the first cars had arrived in town by 1909 and 1910. The wooden sidewalks were taken up and replaced by cement ones. This work was done by Henry Muster and Hal Patrol. They also did other masonry work around town, and Henry Muster was my uncle.
There was a book on blizzards of 1952. How did the settlers manage at this time?
The worst blizzard at that time occurred on January 12, 1988, when a terrible storm roared out of the northwest with little warning after a mild, still morning. 174 deaths resulted from the storm, all east of the Missouri River. Mr. and Mrs. Dodd and their little daughter Nellie were caught in the storm on their way home. They went as far as they could, and then Mr. Dodd turned the sled over on top of his wife and daughter and the family dog and set out through the deep snow for help. He walked about 3 miles to New Blackman's house for help. And Swan Rosenquist, Mr. Blackman's hired man, went back with him. They made it as far as the present home of Don Jarvis and could smell the smoke. Mr. Dodd was very tired and wanted to lay down, but Mr. Rosenquist kept him going. They finally found the house and stayed overnight. The next morning, they did locate the sled and were much surprised to find Mrs. Dodd, the daughter, and the dog still alive. The child was okay, but Mrs. Dodd had to have her legs amputated.
Well, so much for
I think Newt remembers this incident also, don't you? You've heard your dad talk about this incident? What was the incident, how he kept him
My
going?
father and Swan Rosenquist talk about it. It seems like Mr. Dodd had wandered around about 3 hours before he came to my father's homestead, and he begged my father to go with him. And my father said no, he wouldn't go out. He'd wait till the storm stopped. He cried and cried, and this Swan Rosenquist was just over from Sweden, so he said he felt sorry for him, and so he would go. So my dad told him, well, he would let him go if he's got a rope and tied them together. And they wandered around. I guess I don't know how many hours they wandered, but they got into a little cornfield there where Jarvis lived. And Swan said they went back and forth several times in that. And he kind of talked a little broken. He said, Mr. Dodd wanted to, he laid down, and Swan says, I kicked the hell out of him. Got him up. And he said they smelled smoke. And they kept getting closer to this smoke. And it was a Ottman, people by the name of Ottman homestead he did. And then they got into the house, and eventually they found these people. And a team of And Mr. Dodd had turned the team loose. And the next morning they found the team down in front of where Della Mutzicker's folks lived. And they were standing up, frozen solid, just dead, standing there. That's all I know about that.
Well, so much for the serious side of things. Can we hear something about funny sides and funny incidents and there's got to be some. A few.
In 1910, an incident causing much ado and laughter was the time the local lady of the evening had been seeing too much of the local businessman on the sly. Her husband knew of this affair, so one day he followed her to the depot from where she expected to board a train for Mitchell to meet her lover. He was angry, and upon finding her there, he slapped her around, tore off all her clothes. Then pulling her by the hair, he dragged her home. Oftentimes, the Enterprise, the local paper, ran warnings to the husband telling him to watch out for Duke, from north of Ethan, who had a way and a want for the ladies. A gentleman from Ethan told me that lady was gay and the husband was very passive. Another dealer of stoves and shovels was Ira Cutts, who had 3 boys. One was Sam. Sam was a little bit rowdy and had in trouble most of the time. Rather than punish him, his father would protect him with a bullwhip, and as the town marshal was afraid of the father, he went on being the toughest kid in town. An incident that caused quite a stink in town in 1890 involved Sam and the marshal. Sam Cutts killed the skunk in his dad's barn and would not remove it. Citizens complained, but to no avail, as the marshal was afraid of his dad. So the skunk was left to decay, much to the dismay of the local townspeople.
That's great.
I got some more here.
Go ahead.
In 1910, a farmer east of Ethan came home from the field for his noon meal. His 3 children were standing on the porch. His wife had taken the horse and buggy and left. That evening, he found the horse and buggy tied to a post by the Ethan depot. His wife boarded the passenger train, never to be seen again. On February 22nd, 1949, Little Oster will be in the Whippy Hall. Dance after the show. Old and new time music. Louise and Sylvia Hohen, who are with the group from Ethan, they also play their mandolin and guitar over the Sioux Falls radio. One more. Go ahead, I'll find it later.
Oh, that's great. There were sure some unusual characters in Ethan history.
To be sure there were. Old Curly was given this name because of his long, bushy red hair. His hair hung down from an old black hat that he usually wore, along with an old sloppy, baggy clothes. He was unable to walk very well, and each day he would stagger from his little shack at the east edge of Ethan, about where Bill Kretschmer used to live, and go for his mail. After resting on one of the town benches, he would slowly go home again. No one knew much about him except that he dealt with the stock market. Some thought he was rich, but no one knew for sure because he dressed so poorly. He loved to fish and often raced with another old man, Esley Moore, for a certain fishing hole at the James River. Often they were racing side by side, beating their horses to see who would be lucky enough to get to the spot first. Old Curly's last name was Morgreed, and he was known to have his 2 sons, Charlie and Oliver, who came to visit occasionally. His one son was also considered odd, very reserved and very religious. One day someone noticed that old Curly hadn't made his daily trek up to the post office, so they decided to check. They found him dead in his shack one cold wintry day, and Ethan had lost a queer but likable old man. And by the way, he used to work for Ray Westrook when he first got here.
Another interesting old man of the early 1900s was an old man by the nickname of Happy Hooligan. No one ever knew for sure his real name, but every spring he would return to Ethan, always wearing worn-out shabby clothes and carrying a roll on his stick over his shoulder, hobo style. He would wander from door to door asking for goods, but more often for money. Each time he would stop at a home, he would pull up his pants leg and show his sore leg. The sore was long and raw open sore about the length of his leg, a red swollen and usually bloody and absent. Naturally, everybody giving money to have a doctor, but that was his racket. It was believed that he used some caucus to irritate it so that he would get the sympathy of the residents. One spring he had failed to ride. He was missed by all because he became part of the spring. And then we probably had a few other people in our area that we all kind of remember. One would be like Matt Zine, who used to live west of Eason. He used to drive an old Model D Ford to town, and then later a horse on an old hair rack. And throughout the years, he operated as a bachelor out there. And then in the early 1950s, some way or another, somebody turned him into being cruel to animals. He was taken into court and they forced him to sell his livestock and his land. And that took place in about 51 and 52. And he took off for California, the Los Angeles area, and he said, "Is this what the people of the Easton or the Davidson County think of me?" He said, "I don't want to live here anymore." So he left the country.
I think Newt can remember something about this.
Devonia. There's a few other things I remember about old Matt Zion too.
Okay, good.
He was always humped over and leaning like this here kind of, and his face was real bronze from the way, and his hair was white and shoulder length. And when he'd come over and talk to Dad or my Uncle Henry Rumbles, he'd drive that old Ford and be going maybe 10, 15, or 20 miles an hour, and his hair screaming behind, tut, 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 down the road. And I don't know whatever became of the car, but later years it went to the team of horses and a wagon or a hay rack. And then some years there, when it was so cold, he would go in the cistern and sleep in the cistern. And in his later years, I guess he was, during the night, was sitting in a chair and with a lantern keeping him warm, and his pants caught fire and it burned his legs quite bad, and he was in the Mitchell Hospital for a while, and the nurses said it took 3 bath waters to get him warm, or to get him clean. But he didn't have a telephone, and he usually go over to Lydia Rumbles and Henry's to use the phone, or over to Roland Bowler's when he lived there yet. And you see him walking across the field, kind of stooped over, and some people were kind of afraid of him, and he was noted to have some of the nicer horses in the area in his younger days, and he was kind of a horse doctor also. I heard stories that if someone had a sick horse and couldn't get it well, they'd call Matt and he'd come and doctor it, and then he'd sleep with the horse during the night. And he was just that kind of a guy. And we'd hear him, if the wind was right, we was down to where Bootsy Weber's lived now, and he was bucking up hay that didn't get harvested one year, and he had his horses, and he was yelling at his horses, and he talks to them just like people. He had them named, and you'd hear his voice coming on the wind, just shouting and calling them by name, and to whoa this, whoa Nelly, get going Tom. He was quite a guy.
Well, he had a Model T Ford touring car. I first remembered who he was, so I kept saying, "Whoa, what's that?" Right into a meadow west of my father's farm. We could hear him yelling, "Whoa, whoa!" He was trying to stop that old Model T, and he couldn't get it stopped. Finally, he ran into a fence. It stopped, and my oldest brother Paul went down, got him started, headed him down the road. I guess he got home. And also, he was talking about how he always used to wear in the wintertime an old bearskin coat. always felt Matt with a bearskin coat. Another little anecdote, when I worked in a drugstore, he used to always come in on Sunday after church, and he wanted a little of this, and he'd feed his horses, want a dram of this and a dram of that, and an ounce of something else. I don't know if any of you remember Mac McDonald. Well, he got pretty mad at times. And Matt always come in about the time he wanted to go home and eat. And one Sunday he came in and wanted this and that. Seemed that his horse needed a physic. Mac was pretty mad, and he told Matt, he said, if you'd get away from the back end of that horse, go around and look the horse in the face, you wouldn't need a physic. Matt got pretty mad and took off. Long time.
There was another thing in his house. He didn't have curtains on the windows, but his stove would smoke and he wouldn't clean up. And if you tried to look in from the outside, the windows had enough smoke on, you couldn't see what was in there. But some fellows that was in the house told me that there was just a path going from the door to his stove and where his table was, and he'd throw his boxes and newspapers on each side. And he got groceries at Bob Swadeus's. And he had, I guess he might have called either from Bo's or Henry's and wondered if they didn't have some of that pickled meat with the screw-on lids, because the ones with the other lid, after he had them open, the rats would get those lids off and get at the meat.
Matt died out in Los Angeles, Skid Row in about 1960.
Urban, I think you knew a story why some of the people in Ethan were afraid of Curly. Remember you mentioned about your dad?
Yeah, some of the people, us kids were definitely scared of old Curly, you know. And we used to have quite a time, you know, he'd be sitting at that bench, you know, and we'd walk by him and just kind of look out from that old hat, you know. But he didn't scare me near as much as Robert Whippy's grandpa. He was the town marshal about that time. I probably was in the 3rd or 4th grade, and I was throwing snowballs. This fellow's name was Charlie Stockwell. And I was throwing snowballs, and he stood on the edge of the sidewalk. He called me over there, and of course I was standing down below him, you know, and he was up on the sidewalk, a little boy. And he said, "By golly, you little boy," he said, "I throw you in the jug if you do that again." And I've been scared of marshals ever since.
Whippy Garage, we are told, sold first Chevy cars in Ethan. Don Jarvis, what do you know about it?
I understand that in 1911, Joe Whippy Sr., an old pioneer of Ethan, died, and his 2 sons took over the machine shop that he owned. They ran an implement shop also and sold the first Chevy cars in Ethan until they both went to World War I. While they were gone to the war, their mother sold the shop to the Farmers Elevator Company. After the war ended, the 2 boys returned and started a garage where the old Catholic church had stood. They started selling cars and fixing machinery again. Then in 1914, the Whippy brothers built a large hall on the south side of Main Street, which is this part of the Legion Hall we're in now. The hall was used for dances, movies, ball games, and meetings during the early 1920s. The movies were silent movies at that time until 1924, when they were replaced by the talking movies. Lawrence Welk played for dance in this hall in the late 1920s. Later on, the town people held a free program here each Saturday night to draw trade to the town. Local talent provided the entertainment, and prizes were drawn and given to the lucky winners. The hall was usually crowded and drew much business to the locality. At this time, many gas stations changed owners. Gas stations changed owners very often. The earliest gas stations in Ethan were built in the late 1920s. 2 that are remembered were built by J.J. Donovan, 1 block north of Main Street. Charlie Grady built a station at the present site of Agland Co-op. Ernest Rumble Sr. built a new building there later on where he had a cafe. He sold the building which is now presently Agland Co-op. Bob, I think you have some information on the Whippy stores.
Yes, in 1920, Joseph and Elizabeth Whippy started one of the first grocery stores after they had purchased it from Dr. Sogsdale. They ran the store for 5 years. Then they sold the store to Minnie and Mary Whippy. And this was called Priester's Store. I think everybody remembers that. During that time, they lived upstairs above the store. They had quite a few rooms. It was quite a large store. Down below there was 3 rooms where they had different supplies: dry goods, groceries, meats, vegetables, and they bought eggs. The farmers would bring eggs in and exchange them. They would pay them for the eggs and exchange them for groceries, shoes, or whatever they needed for their family. And I think everybody remembers that when they took their egg case home, when I got home, that was the first thing the kids looked for was the big sack of candy that they used to put in the egg case. And I don't know the exact date, but I think it was around 1945 or 46 when Mary sold it back. Minnie took the store over, and Minnie and Frank run the store, deleted the grocery department out, and just had dry goods. And they continued this, I think, until about 1952 or 51 or 52. I think that's when they closed the store. I just can't remember the exact date.
Just found in the Eastern Enterprise, Lawrence Welk played in the Whippy Hall in 1924, and he danced with Minnie Whippy. On August 15, 1920, at a celebration in Easton, a stuntman was doing a high wire walk. He slipped and fell to the ground and was killed in front of the McDonald drugstore.
I could add one more thing on that, John. Minnie still gets a Christmas card every Christmas from Lawrence Welk. He never misses a Christmas card, and he writes a letter to her.
Did you find that one love letter in there yet?
Yeah.
Okay, why don't you take that now? One more time. We can go on to another one.
In 1975, an old house in Easton was being remodeled. In the attic of this house, an old letter was found. It was from a girl to her boyfriend, and it was dated June 1st, 1900. Dear John, the folks will be bringing in eggs and cream Saturday afternoon. They will be at the new Blackman store and doing the grocery buying. About dusk, I will meet you behind our buggy, behind Frank Green's livery barn. I cannot stay long because the folks will catch on. Maybe I can stay an hour. I will have a blanket hid in the oats box. As ever, June.
We have heard about the Bauer store. Somebody fill us in more on that, please?
George Bauer came to South Dakota in 1909 and lived in the house owned by Melvin Moe. Soon after his arrival, he and his brother-in-law, John Schoenfelder, purchased the Burke Toby store, located on the north side of Main Street, that had been built in 1887. They operated as partners and ran a mercantile store. Things didn't work out, and after a year of ill feelings, the pair dissolved the partnership, and Mr. Bauer purchased the Blackman store in 1911 and proceeded to draw most of the trade away from Mr. Schoenfelder. This store was located just south of the new fire station. This store had been owned by Newell Blackman. Bauer did a good business and decided to build a larger store to accommodate his customers. He bought lots across the street from his store, the fire station lot, and erected a huge merchandise store, 2 stories high with 2 large windows facing the main street that were used to display his wares. The first floor was divided into 2 large rooms with a smaller room at the rear. The room on the south was used to display merchandise consisting of clothing, jewelry, yard goods, shoes, and other items. The large room in the north was used as a grocery store, with a small room as a storage room for eggs and boxes. The second floor consisted of 2 rooms, the large one in the front being used for a dance hall and skating rink. Each week, Either skating or a dance took place, attended by large crowds, and it was a very popular and prosperous venture. One cold, wintry night in 1936, during a raging blizzard, the store caught fire and was totally destroyed. Mr. Bauer never rebuilt and later moved to Mitchell, where he operated a variety store in the east part of the city. Although the store was gone, his clerks in Ethan will long be remembered. The clerks that went to Mitchell with him were Dora Bauer and Cecilia Sullivan.
Okay, I'd like to turn to Mrs. Feiner. Can you remember anything about the store?
No, darling.
Oh, yes, you do.
Not really. Yeah, I didn't.
Well, I think, you know, what you was telling about how you had to smile with Kate.
How was I?
Don't you remember when you said...
I remember the clerks in the store was, one of them was Esther Isaacson, one of them was my sister Lois, one of them was Mary Carlo, and Dora. Those are the four I remember the clerks in the grocery store when I was a kid.
No, but what Mrs. Feiner was telling me is that when you run a store, it doesn't make any difference what you like or don't like. You always have to smile. And she said, like, okay, go ahead, take it off. Finish.
That's the way. Well, that's the way Dad ran the store. When you came in, regardless of whether you had any money or what was going to happen, you had to. It's like you were royalty. You're supposed to put your coat down, you know, and greet them with their 30 dozen case of eggs and so on and so forth, and then wait on them. And then you treat them royally, and then they end up probably charging it, and then he'd give him a great big bag of candy or chocolate, and probably never got his money. And when he died, there were so many people that didn't even bother to come to his funeral or pay their bills, which I'm sure most of them know who they are. And I didn't smile for 2 years after I got married, because I had to smile when I was in the store.
There's a lot of people, George Bauer, poor people, that I've heard that he'd slip out and put a sack of flour in their buggy and groceries. That was it. He was a very kind man.
Thank you a lot. We have one more yet.
Is one of the students supposed to say anything? Well, they were supposed to say, was there always an Ethan Lake? No, there were springs on the creek that flowed about 2.5 miles east of Ethan. The springs made a pond known as the Gillespie Pond, named after an old man that came here accompanied by his son. They built an old sod house just west of the present road that leads to the present lake, near a clump of trees that still stand in the Graves pasture. One day, while Mr. Gillespie was away, the house caved in and smothered his child. He then moved further north and built another sod house, just west of the present lake. The remains of this old sod house are faintly visible in the Graves pasture. This area was selected for building of the dam across the creek because the springs never froze over completely in the winter and always provided water in the summer. After the dam was built with WPA workers, the area behind the dam quickly filled with water. The only sad event happened at the lake in 1940 when 3 girls, Phyllis Sprinkle, Margaret Gordon, and Elizabeth Laufenberg, walked to the lake one warm afternoon to go swimming. Suddenly, Elizabeth called for help, and Phyllis swam out to help her. They both sank to the bottom. Margaret ran back to Ethan to get help. The bodies were located by Herman Bauer and Charles Rogers.
One more item of interest in the book. There was a killing in Ethan in 1915. 2 Negro brothers jumped off a freight train. They were wanted men. One Negro walked into the saloon with a meat cleaver. He threatened the lady sitting in her buggy. He tried to force her out of the buggy. Dan Sullivan saw this and hollered at the man. The man ran and Dan took after him. He was crawling over a fence by Joe Robbie's alfalfa patch, and he shot at Dan. Dan pulled his gun and killed him. These 2 black men were unknown. The dead man was sent to remain in a long gunny sack for experiment for the doctors at the laboratory.
All right, we've just touched on a few of the many businesses. One that we didn't do, and that was my mistake because evidently I tore the sheet up when I was supposed to be typing it, was about the elevators. There were 3 of them in this town, and one of our managers is here tonight. I'm glad to see him, one of our old ones, Benny Obrecht. Okay, we had telephone companies. There was 3 of them. I didn't realize this. Newt, could you tell us about the 3 telephone companies we had in Ethan at one time?
It's my understanding about 1905, there was a Ethan Telephone Company, and then Davidson County started a telephone company, and Dakota Central, which was acquired by Bell, they had what's called Line 9 out west, about 10, 12 miles, and then it all eventually came to Davidson County. Of course, there were sister lines east of town, and there was a 12-mile line, and there was Rosedale, Oregon. Then there was one down by Dillon called the Star Telephone. They were all switched out of Eden.
Okay, and one of the latest operators was Lillian Sprinkle. And if you ever go to the museum in Mitchell, the Friends of the Middle Border, you will see the switchboard there. But they have it Mrs. Lillian Sprinkle. I told them one time, but they still haven't changed it. I've been there many years, and it's still Mrs. Sprinkle. We had banks. We didn't touch on that. TK did a really good write-up on it, and somehow I lost his sheet, so I didn't do the banks. I ran out of time. And he did find out, though, that you did have a bank robbery in Ethan. And that was in 1902. And 5 men on horseback came into town, charged the bank, got the money. They got out of town. Nobody knew who they were, and we never got the money back. The money was never found. A few days after that, another incident was Mrs. Frank Green. Newt remembers her also. And at that time, they did have some really vicious dogs. And these 2 bulldogs got in a fight right out on Main Street, and the men tried to stop the dogs, and they were really fighting. So Mrs. Green just went upstairs and got her hot tea kettle, watered them down, poured it on the dogs, and the dogs quit fighting. That's one way to do it. All right. I do hope you enjoyed it tonight. We do have a few expenses, such as, paying for the mic systems and so forth and whatever. And we did leave a pail over there on the table. So if you feel inclined and would like to help out the Centennial Committee by leaving a little donation, we'd surely appreciate it. As soon as we're done here, you got something else you'd like to say?
Well, there's a lot of business places that are deleted in all of this, and frankly, John Clemens had a butcher shop where Bob Swade's store started back in about 1900. I can remember when I was a kid, go by there, he'd stop, come out and give you a wiener. And then there was Schur's and Stouffer Hardware across the street where the post office was at. Of course, we had several saloons in town. Hone and Stouffer was across the street. Tom Navin was down there on the corner where the old pool hall used to be. The first hardware store in town, in fact, was Frank Cole. And then Harry Lassegaard got it afterwards. That's over where that county building's at about. It's where Dale Williams used to be. They moved it out. And there's several other businesses. Bob Swiggs, of course, everybody knows. Bob had a business here. He came here in 1928 or 29. Worked 18 hours a day for 30 years. That's about it, I guess.
One thing I did read in one of the books, I think it was Mr. Jinks's book, or maybe it was Mr. Bernice Graves, I don't remember. That's beside the point. But anyhow, you even had a mail delivery here in town. One of the, I can't remember what the guy did, but then he would also deliver mail in town. I didn't realize that.
Well, there used to be, this town there used to be 2 drugstores, believe it or not. J.D. McDonald had one across the street here. Mr. Frank Hammer had one down on another corner. And then eventually McDonald bought Hammer out. Mr. Hammer was quite an elderly man. He used to walk every night. He'd walk instead of a horse and walk clear around the section. I can remember as a kid, he'd walk by there and he had a stick and he'd just really going. But, So there was 2 drugstores here at one time, as well as 2 banks.
Talking about Miss McDonald, I guess I can remember one incident when we were kids. Our highlight was to come to town with Mom and Dad on Saturday night. Mom bought groceries, and of course this was Dad went to the bar. But anyway, we kids would just walk the streets, and we'd get thirsty, on a hot day, so we'd go in and ask for a cold drink of water from McDonald's. Now I understand why he give us the cold treatment once in a while. He didn't appreciate us very much. But anyhow, we did enjoy the cold drink. Okay.
Talking about doctors, there was a Dr. Paulson was here too. He was one of the last doctors. He was a tall, distinguished guy. He had a mustache, and he used to play poker up over at the drugstore. And they'd go up there and play, and in about 2 hours while the phone would ring, and would answer it, and Mrs. Paulson, she'd wondered, if her husband was there, I'd go get him. He'd come down, and if he was ahead about 20 bucks, he'd had a call out in the country. If he wasn't ahead, he'd never leave.
All right, as John just mentioned, the side of the hall where you people are sitting was the site of the First Security Bank that we tore down. And of course, that was the last bank here in town. Newt, have you thought of anything else? There is one picture that I asked Louina and Pete Schoenfelder to bring along. It's about postcard size, but it's really an interesting picture that maybe they might let someone look at it if you ask them. It's a very early picture of Ethan. You can see the train in the background, especially if you have a magnifying glass. You can really see a lot of neat things on that picture. All right. The last thing in the evening is releasing the balloons. I believe, Mary, it's right out here on the street. And is there anything else now that you'd like to say? I knew there was something about the booster bus. So I'd like to have you tell about that, Mary, please.
We're going to take some booster trips. Tomorrow we're going to Tabor, and the bus will be leaving at 11 o'clock. And we plan to be home by supper time. So anyone that would like to go along, you're welcome. It'll cost you $3 to ride, and we expect to have a lot of fun. And Tuesday night, we're going to leave at 6:30, and we're going to be going south to Tritt and over to Delma, Armour, Corsica, and Stickney, and probably back home by that time. But anyone that would like to go is welcome to go along. It'll cost you $3. So why don't you come along and join us in the fun?
All right, tonight I want to thank Randy Schoenfelder. I had just got one little microphone outfit. Randy Rumble, too, excuse me. Anyway, he come very graciously with all of this hookup for us and made it much easier for us tonight. I do hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you have a nice evening.